So let's take a look at Darwin's theory one more time. The last video left off with his theory in 3 steps. Number 1, remember that variation exists within every population or species. Some individuals are better suited to survive as a result of the variation, and then they go on and reproduce. And then over time, those traits spread and take over until the environment changes and the process begins all over again. So reproductive isolation, so how do new species form? One of the ways that new species can form is through reproductive isolation. Reproductive isolation is a condition in which 2 populations of the same species do not breed with one another because of, and there are 3 different options. The first one is because of geographic isolation. The second one is difference in mating times. So the first one being separated maybe by a river, by a mountain, maybe a flood could have taken place, but they are geographically isolated, thus they can't reproduce. Difference in mating times, or they get isolated from some other barrier to reproduction, such as not finding one another attractive or producing offspring that are not fertile or unable to produce offspring themselves. But over time, 2 populations that are reproductively isolated, they will no longer be able to reproduce with one another, and in that case, that's when you get new species forming. This can cause what is known as speciation, which is the process by which a new species form. And speciation is often caused by divergence, which is the accumulation of differences between 2 groups. So often divergence causes speciation. And this can create what is known as a subspecies, where you have populations of the same species that differ genetically because of adaptations to different living conditions. Tigers are a very good example of subspecies. I want to say there are 9 different subspecies of the Bengal tiger, all based on different living conditions. So different in their striping patterns, different in their coat color, those types of things. The last thing that we need to talk about is 2 different types of evolution that can take place. One of them is called gradualism, which is the model of evolution in which there is a gradual change over a long period of time, and that will lead to new species formation. Or another model of evolution would be known as punctuated equilibrium, where there are periods of rapid change in a species, and then there are periods of little or no change, or some type of spurt, and this is typically caused by a quick environmental change. And this produces, in the evolutionary timescale, this produces this produces a different method of morphological change. So you can see this is a gradual change, a gradual speciation where these 2 separated, where you have these different ones where there was some type of environmental change that happened here that resulted in this, versus another environmental change that resulted in this. This is just another example that gives you, it shows evolution over time. You have a rapidly changing environment followed by a rapidly changing environment followed by a stable environment, and then a rapidly changing environment, whereas gradualism shows just a gradual change over time. Last thing that I want to leave off with is just a little bit of review of evolution. You should be able to describe how natural selection occurs. You should be able to compare punctuated equilibrium with the gradualism model. And then the last question here is that speciation can result when two populations have become, and the correct answer is B, reproductive isolation. What I want to pick up with right now is evidence for evolution. So how do we know that this actually does take place? In class so far, we've talked about what evolution is, some of the men who had major contributions to the theory of evolution, but where did this theory come from and why do most scientists believe it? Really, the question is, what evidence is there to support this theory? Okay, and there's actually evidence from many different fields of science that contribute to the theory of evolution. The first one is paleontology. Paleontology is the study of fossil forms of all life. The next one is anatomy, which is the branch of biology that deals with the structure of organisms. Embryology, which is the branch of biology that studies the development of organisms. And finally, molecular biology, which is the branch of biology that deals with the structure and function of macromolecules essential to life. Darwin's theory is almost universally accepted by scientists as the best available explanation for biological diversity on Earth. Scientists can at least agree on the following 3 points. The first one is that they say that the Earth is about 4.5 billion years old. Organisms have inhabited the Earth for most of its history. And that all organisms living today share some common ancestry with earlier, simpler life forms. The first example that I want to show you is for evidence of evolution is the fossil record. A fossil is a preserved or mineralized remain or imprint of an organism that lived long ago. And fossils are nice because they provide an actual record of Earth's past life forms. And they also can point out intermediate forms of life that show how a species evolved from one form to another. But the fossil record is incomplete. And why is it incomplete? Many species actually live in environments where fossils don't form. Most flesh is going to decay or be scattered by a scavenger before a fossil can be formed. The best fossils are actually formed when organisms with hard exoskeletons are rapidly buried in the fine sediments deposited by water, wind, or volcanic eruptions. I have a quick little video that shows how fossils form.
I know, so if it's on everybody's nerves, and this is how it goes. Enough.
Fossils are the stone remains of animals or plants that were once alive. Fossils can be the bones of a dead dinosaur or his big footprints in the sand. Usually, only the skeletons of animals are left after millions of years. But sometimes a whole animal, like a woolly mammoth, gets trapped in the ice. The ice stays frozen for thousands of years, and paleontologists are lucky to find a whole creature that has barely changed over time. Or an insect gets stuck in tree sap. The sap hardens into a hard, clear material called amber. These creatures look just the way they did when they first wandered into the sap millions of years ago. Let's look at the way dinosaur bone fossils are made. Most dinosaur fossils are formed by mold and cast. Imagine a stegosaurus drowns in a river and its body sinks to the bottom of the riverbed. The flesh of the animal rots away or is eaten by smaller creatures. Eventually, only the bones are left. Mud and sand, called sediment, cover the skeleton over many years. More layers of sediment fall on the skeleton. Over time, the floor of the river sinks from the weight of the sediment. The lower layers of soft mud and sand are pressed into hard rock. Now the skeleton is completely surrounded by compressed stone. The bone is slowly washed away by little trickles of water. This water is called groundwater. The bones leave an open space in the exact shape of the dinosaur skeleton. This open space is called a natural mold. Now the groundwater brings tiny pieces of rock into those empty spaces. After millions of years, these tiny rock pieces fill the mold. The rock is pressed further and further underground. Over time, the entire skeleton mold becomes solid rock. Many years later, the rock surrounding the skeleton rises to the Earth's surface. This can happen during an earthquake or as mountains rise naturally. The top layers of rock are worn away by wind and rain. Slowly, wind and rain show the fossils to the outside world. Not all fossils rise to the surface. Many times they remain under layers and layers of rock, and paleontologists have to dig a long time to find them.
So the next video that I have for you is actually evidence of whale evolution and intermediate life forms that actually show that an ancient ancestor of a whale actually was found on land and had legs. And they slowly evolved over time to be the modern toothed whale that we know today. And we have evidence of this evolution using fossils. Okay, so this just shows you whale evolution from land to sea. Okay, that's using the fossil record. The next evidence or piece of evidence that we have of evolution deals with anatomy and development. The anatomy of different types of organisms reveal basic similarities in body structure, and even though the structure's function may differ between organisms. We have what is known as vestigial structures, which are structures in an organism that is reduced in size and function that may have been complete and functional in an organism's ancestors. So some examples that we have in humans are the human appendix, your wisdom teeth, evidence of a tailbone, the erector pili, which is actually the little muscle that causes your hair to stand up when you get goosebumps, your body hair all over, hind leg bones in whales, wings on flightless birds. Some snakes are known to actually have hip bones. Even fish that are blind, they have eyes under their skin. And actually dandelions make pollen even though they reproduce asexually. So these are examples of structures that now don't really serve a function, but in some ancestor they could have been very important. So that's another piece of evidence. We have the fossil record, we have anatomy and development, and then we have an example. We have two very important words that you need to know. If you remember, the prefix homo means the same. So we have what is known as homologous structures, which are structures that share common ancestry. So a similar structure can be found in two organisms, and they can be found in a common ancestor, even though they may have different functions. So what this is showing is homologous structures. This is comparing a human arm, a cat leg, a dolphin flipper, and a bat wing. And this is color-coded, and you can see that in both the leg, the arm, the flipper, and the wing, there are homologous structures. This is all due to a common ancestor. Now the opposite of this would be an analogous structure, which is structures that serve the same function, but they actually are not derived from a common ancestor. The example here would be this bottom half of the picture where you have bat wings, butterfly wings, and bird wings. They do the same thing. They're all three of these are used for flight, but bats, butterflies, and birds actually do not share any common ancestor. So that's the major difference here between homologous structures where they did share common ancestry, and then analogous structures, they have no common ancestor. Still in talking about anatomy and development, evolutionary history can also be seen in the development of embryos. During some time in their development, all vertebrates have a tail, have buds that become limbs, and also have pharyngeal pouches that will eventually go on to become the gills and the throat. If you take a look at this picture, let me blow this up a little bit for you. You can take a look. This is a fish, a salamander, a tortoise, a chick, a rabbit, and a human. You can see how similar we look in early development. Okay, there's your tail at some point, buds that will become limbs. So it's really crazy to take a look at that. And then the last piece of evidence that we have for evolution is that we have biological molecules. So if species have changed over time, as the fossil record indicates, then genes that determine the species characteristics should also have changed by mutation and selection. So if you look at the specific biological molecules like proteins or DNA sequences, you can see similarities between closely related organisms. So species that have descended from a recent common ancestor will have fewer amino acid differences between their proteins than do species that share a common ancestor in the more distant past. And also, so that's talking specifically about amino acid differences. And then if you take a look at DNA sequences, evolutionary histories based on DNA sequences are similar to evolutionary histories based on comparative anatomy and the fossil record. So there are your major pieces of evidence, of evolution: biological molecules, the fossil record, and overall anatomy and development.